Hey folks, Randy Newberg here. We're ready to bring you another episode of Hunt Talk Radio, also known as Randy Newberg Unfiltered. Today I have with me a guest who I've known for a long time, and I guess that's a function of how long he's been working on threatened and endangered species issues for the state of Montana, and how long I've been suckered into being a hunter advocate on threatened and endangered species issues. So, my guest is Arnie Dood. I've known Arnie for 20 some years, and he worked for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Montana's state agency, for what, Arnie? For 40,
40
years?
years.
25 of that on threatened and endangered species
That's
issues.
right,
So, well, thanks for being here, Arnie. For those of you listening, we're going to get into some discussions of things that in our Hunt Talk forum, so many of you have asked questions related to wolves, grizzly bears, sage grouse, and the Endangered Species Act. Because you hear about it, but I would say by and large the complications of that act, the complication of process causes most hunters to just tune out, and a lot of times we get our information in bits and pieces from our buddy.
Yeah, you see that quite a lot.
Yeah, whereas the other side has made this a business model. And when I say the other side, it's the people who are usually litigating when anything's to our favor or represents our interest. And
Yeah, I think Randy, one of the places to start with is to recognize that the Endangered Species Act, as it was written and passed, is really a reflection of the values of the people of the United States, and it was overwhelmingly passed.
in 1972,
73.
Right? 73, okay.
And it reflects that most people are not about wiping things out.
Right.
And the act, when it was written, was written and intended to give us a chance to maybe take a look at what we're doing and how we're conducting ourselves, and is there a way that we could do and move forward without jeopardizing the existence of different animals. And so it's a very powerful tool.
Right.
And I think that's why what you see is that there are certain groups with their interest that they saw a place where they could elevate their ability to impact programs.
Right.
And again, because the act is such a powerful statute, they were able to do it. What's interesting to me is if you go back and read the language of the act when it was written, there's a lot of stuff in there about working with the states and cooperating with the states and the kinds of tools, the flexibility that may be there in order to recover threatened and endangered species. And it's my opinion that over time what we've seen is that the relationship with the states was weakened. The flexibility that was intended to be there was diminished.
Heavily diminished.
So I think that's one of the things that why people have questions about what's our role or how does it work, because they see that there's decisions made and actions that are taken as a result of litigation or other things, and it feels like maybe. Particularly from a hunting perspective, you may not see a positive place for you
Right.
in the program. It comes across as a negative. That
Right.
it's one of the limiting things in terms of my interest. And I think we need to work on that. I think that there are ways that we can, in the future, change that dynamic and it'll be up to hunters, to be advocates and to be engaged and knowledgeable and do it in a good way to have a positive impact for the future.
Yeah. Well, I need to make a disclaimer that I said Arnie worked for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the proper term there is past tense because I need to make sure that no one thinks you're here speaking on behalf of a state
No,
agency.
I'm not speaking on behalf of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I retired on the 3rd of July this year.
Yeah.
I'm currently happily retired and
Hunting.
hunting and fishing.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that, and
Yeah.
enjoying my life. So
Yeah.
I spent a lot of years, dealing with fairly difficult issues and contentious meetings and things like that. And so it's been quite a nice. It was a great hunting season for me.
Yeah. Good. Well, and for those of you who are viewers or listeners, I don't want this to sound Montana centric, but I live in Bozeman, Montana, and that's where we're broadcasting from this morning. And in my backyard, there's a trail that a mile from my house is a trailhead that if I walk south, I'd walk to what I'll call this big wildlife testing ground, if you want to call it that, called Yellowstone Park. And Yellowstone Park, everybody thinks is this big happy place where all the animals get along great, and it's not touched by the hands of man and everything else. And obviously, we know nothing could be further from the truth. But as a result of living here, just geographically, as a hunter, I get sucked into national discussions on endangered species issues. Whether it's grizzly bears, whether it's the gray wolf reintroduction in the northern Rockies, just to the east of me, and even here to some degree, we had the whole sage grouse issue that was finally, some guidance was given in September. But every one of these ESA issues that affect hunters, or that I've engaged in, like you said, definitely affect hunters. And if there's one thing I've noticed, it's that hunters have a tendency to just, they rely on the traditional systems that hunters have of, okay, the group I'm a member of is going to represent my interest. Well, that's okay, but that not necessarily is the best way. This is complicated. I don't want to, the process is so complicated. I don't want to deal with it. The process seems to at times be abused. I don't trust the process. So we got all these reasons why I think hunters have a tendency to not be as engaged as they could or should be to make sure our interest is represented.
Yeah, Randy, I think that what happens there is the hurdles that you've talked about in terms of people. People may not know when's the appropriate point to be engaged or where in the process. A lot of times there's so many processes going on. It's really hard to keep track of what's all happening out there in terms of these issues. And let's recognize that the ESA issues go well beyond the species that tend to be the focal point of ESA discussions. I mean, in Montana we have other species like least terns that go up and down the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and are on the coast and the Gulf. Piping plovers the same. So there's issues. I think one of the things, and again, not if you look at these beyond just Montana, the vast majority of the ESA issues that come up with the species that may be threatened or endangered aren't going to be solved with any one state. It's going to take a combination of states working together across the range of the species. Doesn't mean that the animals will be recovered everywhere that they were historically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that naive, but it does mean that we need to look at how people can contribute in different places. And then for hunters, I think it's important that they find those avenues to make sure that their interest are included in the program. And I'll give you an example. And you and I were part of talking, and working on the gray wolf and the whole recovery effort that was there. There's some incredible nuances because in Montana, our home state, wolves were already recovering before the reintroduction into Yellowstone, which brought up a unique set of issues. And it also reflects, I think people accept animals sort of coming on their own better than they do when they're brought in, although the outcome will ultimately be the same with the animals in the area. And so we were part of those discussions. Well, what do wolves need to survive? They need big animals with 4 feet,
Right.
like deer, elk, moose, and
Yep.
they need those to survive. I mean, in spite of the odd beaver snacker eating a bowl here or there,
Yeah.
it's not going to carry the
Right.
program.
Right.
And so what happened, and what you and I both tried very hard to do through the wolf, the whole process that happened with wolves, was to express, what do hunters need? Hunters, I'm a hunter. I need elk and moose and sheep and deer, and I need those things too. And unfortunately, what happened is that instead of the recognition that hunters put a lot of time and energy, and landowners and other people in different states across the United States, to recover deer and elk and antelope, and those they put decades,
Yep.
literally decades into it. And then the wolf, is sort of put in as the frosting on the cake. And to me, it's really wrong. It's really, the wolf is just another piece of that recovery puzzle. So the discussion needed to be, from my perspective, and I think from legitimately from a hunter's perspective, is okay, if a wolf population of this size needs a certain amount of game in order to survive, how are we going to come up with that?
Right.
The easy avenue is, we'll just, for groups that aren't interested in that, was to just say, we'll just use what's there.
Right.
And that creates a real problem.
It does, and it almost became the feeling that hunters got to write the check for what the other guy wanted.
Yeah.
And so, but
and then recognize too is that because of the constraints of ESA, a lot of times, at least until a delisting occurs, that hunters are sort of put aside,
right.
In terms of, we don't want you involved in the management of this animal. So not only do you get to provide the food that they need, and let's face it, they need habitat as well, and hunters have been huge advocates for habitat, which is for all wildlife,
right.
not just wolves and the big things, but for the little guys too, and the birds and all that. And so, they're like, okay, so this is where I'm at, and then you tell me you don't ever want me to participate in terms of being able to harvest a wolf, or and so that creates a lot of internal stress and negative feeling.
It does. It creates this whole series of problems that I think we're dealing with on many issues. And I'm going to roll back the hands of time even a little further, and I'm going to use this example just because this was Randy Newberg's learning process for the ESA. And it's thanks to you and Kurt Alt that I got suckered into this.
You're welcome.
In 1998 or 99, I got a call from Governor Mark Roscoe's office. And he said, can't even remember who made the call. One of his staffers said, Randy, your name has been thrown out there as the person who should represent hunters in Montana back even further. Each 3 states, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, got to nominate submit 5 people to put on this council called the Governor's Grizzly Bear Roundtable. So the 15 of us from the 3 different states, our job was to help the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service come up with the conservation strategy that would be used for the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear population. So I get this phone call, and I'm like, who in the hell gave my name for this thing? So I called down to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and I'm like, you guys know anything about what's going on? And you and Kurt get this smile on your face, like, yeah, we thought you'd be the guy to do it. So Randy got talked into a 3-year commitment. I think it was 3-year. Man, we met a lot.
Yeah, it wasn't an overnight deal.
No, we would meet we'd rotate every quarter. We'd meet in one of the 3 states, and all of us would travel, and it was this very, very long process, big time commitment. But for me becoming engaged in hunting issues on a national level, it was really, really helpful. And it really opened my eyes to how complicated the process is. It opened my eyes to how what a juggling act it is for any agency when you're saying, I'm going to manage a species or try to recover a species, and the normal state-led focus of most of our wildlife is kind of handed off to a parent agency, if you want to call it that, or a higher agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is in charge of when the ESA kicks in. And so there are so many things I learned. And Governor Roscoe said, Randy, your job, I've got someone here who's one of our 5 is going to be from the environmental world. One of them's going to be from the ag producer world. One's going to be from the tourism world. One's going to be from the timber world. You are there to represent hunters. That's your job. So Randy walks into this meeting with 15 other people, and I feel like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. I'm like, man, I got to represent hunters in the whole discussion of how grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area are going to be recovered, how they're going to be managed. But also, when you get into that discussion, you get into so many other things about, hunters are killing grizzly bears when there's a hunter-bear conflict. And hunters seem to be taking a huge hit of responsibility for all that. But that's a tangent. Point is, we go through that process, and we come up with this among all of us, and working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we take public comment, we read public comment, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pretty much uses what we have as their conservation strategy that they put forth for managing grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area. And I remember this guy named Arnie Dood said, Randy, I'm so glad you're involved in that, because this is plowing the path for what we're going to do with wolves, because we hadn't quite reached the delisting criteria on wolves at that point. And I'm thinking, wow, we'll be done with grizzly bears in a year or two then. So here we are, almost January 2016, and we still haven't come to a solution on grizzly bears as far as the courts agreeing with what we should do it.
I mean, the Yellowstone area was delisted, and then was relisted because of litigation.
Yeah.
Again, some of these things, it's sort of the birthing process that you're going to go through, because delisting as a process and what it means is fairly new. I mean, let's face it, species that are threatened or endangered are usually in significant trouble, and so you're not going to turn those things around in a heartbeat. It's a little different with some animals like wolves. I mean, the thing with wolves is that there were and still are lots of opportunities to recover wolves. I mean, it's different than an animal like ferrets, where there were only a handful left in the world.
Yeah.
So you have to look at, why are we taking advantage of or why aren't we taking advantage of some of these opportunities? And I think delisting the grizzly bear, what happened with wolves, and if you look at the agony that went through in terms of the recovery criteria were met, there was an attempt to delist, and it was litigated and then relitigated, and then finally a congressional action to delist in Montana and Idaho again. And you can look at Wyoming, and I think it's very disappointing that they've been unable to come forward with what's a reasonable program in terms of how it affects animals and how it's perceived by the people that we're working for. Mm-hmm. And so it's been held up, and Wyoming still doesn't have the ability to manage the wolves, and I think that's unfortunate. Yeah. But on all of these things, I think it brings up a lot of issues in terms of what is the criteria going to be for recovery? What does it look like? Who's going to participate in recovery? There's opportunities for other states to participate in wolf recovery, and it's happening with Washington and Oregon, and their wolves are able to move really easily across the landscape. Yeah. And they're going to continue to do that. With grizzly bears, you look at the focus of recovery's been on Montana and a little in Wyoming.
Right.
A limited amount in Idaho.
Very limited.
And so again, we look at all of these things, Randy, and you were a part of those kinds of discussions, is that it's important that hunters bring forth what their interests are, what their ideas and solutions are, It's one of the issues around the Endangered Species Act of how do you deal with success? How can we change the future so that animals that are recovered can be delisted? Um, there were some animals like brown pelicans that were had been threatened by DDT, and they would crush their eggs, and so they weren't producing young. And but once DDT was banned, the pelicans, along with ospreys, which were never listed, and
Right.
and eagles, which were listed, I mean, peregrine falcons started to do better. Uh, but they were at a point where some of the areas were near historic high levels of brown pelicans before they were talking about delisting. And it's
Yeah.
like, I like to think about, if you look at an animal that, and again, keep in mind that this is what we're struggling with grizzly bears, but with peregrine falcons, we set a recovery objective that was 20 pairs. And the reason for that was because 20 pairs would be producing the same amount of young that we were reintroducing into Montana as a fully listed endangered species.
Right.
And we felt that at that point, they would be able to go on, and what we were reintroducing was enough to allow the population to increase. So if they're producing that much, it should,
Right.
and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And then the peregrine falcon was ultimately delisted. And I think that's the kind of model we need to look at for success. Now, obviously what happens with animals like bears and wolves is they're high profile animals.
Right.
They're high focus. There's a high level of interest in it. And so we know it's going to get more scrutiny. It's going to get more input. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think,
Right.
again, when we look at in Montana with the bear management programs here and the state plans, the initial state plan, in southwest Montana, we had over 7,600 plus comments on it. A lot of comments were, save the bear or get rid of the bear kind of thing. But there were others that were ones that were specific to the program, and people brought forth ideas. And then if you look at the next one that we did was in northwest Montana, we updated the plan there, and we ended up with fewer than 200 comments because people could see that their concerns, their interests were being addressed. Maybe not perfectly, but that's life. I mean, all of us are. I go home and I get to compromise with my wife on, do we get new flooring or not? So, I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to bring people to the table, but we have to find a way. It's like with the grizzly bears. If we stay focused, the Yellowstone area, when you were a part of that program, and even before, in the late 70s, early 80s, the estimate was a couple hundred bears. It was over 500 in the Northern Continental Divide, but the Northern Continental Divide is over 1,000 now. The Yellowstone's a minimum of 700, and I've heard from colleagues that they're comfortable with it. Could be 1,000.
Yeah.
So and you look at it, if we're not able to move forward here, and move forward, I want to say this because this is really important for hunters to understand. The argument about delisting should not be about hunting. And
Correct.
what you'll see, and you'll see all of the the non-governmental groups that don't like hunting, and even you'll see some of the states, and you'll see some of the hunter groups. They make it an argument about hunting.
Right.
Hunting is just one of the management tools that wildlife managers have. And there are times in places where it's appropriate. There are different levels of hunting that are appropriate. Those are all decisions you make. But the decision about delisting is the species recovered to the point where it can continue to move forward and thrive without the sort of heavier interventions that are required by ESA. One of our previous directors in Montana back in the late 80s, where it was apparent that the Northern Continental Divide had achieved the recovery objective, wrote a letter
For grizzly bears.
Said, look, we need to move forward on this. And he said, our perspective on it is it doesn't mean less commitment. It means more, because we have bears and a healthy bear population, and we should all celebrate that, including the NGOs that want to see a healthy bear population. But when you make it an argument about hunting, then it's, do you hunt or not hunt?
Right.
And then you see people will say, like with grizzly bears, like I tell people, they're looking for, the day of delisting, the pitchforks and torches come out and they're going to go out on a rampage. Well,
Right.
that's not very helpful. And I personally, if you looked at the program in Montana, for the area around Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide, it was set up that, look, we're very much interested in hunting. It's a legitimate tool. There's lots of reasons why hunting is actually an important tool for the long-term conservation of bears and to build support so that they can occupy broader landscapes. That's really important.
Yeah.
And we lay that out, but we don't make it and I've tried to avoid making it the discussion for delisting. Like,
right.
We're going to delist so we can hunt.
Right. That's an absolute put the truck in reverse approach to it.
That's correct.
And so for the sake of the viewer or listener, I want to just quickly walk through how a basic framework of this works. So, Endangered Species Act is a federal level law that says if it's petitioned to the and it's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
Department of Interior,
right, which is not your state fish and game agency, and so we will use whatever species you want. That someone says this species is in peril. They petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of study the status of where is it, what's the trend, where's it going. If the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decides, yes, that species is in danger, it is threatened, management and the whole what we call listing, in other words, it gets put on the endangered species list. Management of that species is no longer a state-led management. It is a federal-led management, supposedly in coordination with the states. And I want the listener to understand that when we say delisting, what delisting means is it is determined that this species is no longer endangered, that threatened or endangered, that a conservation strategy is in place both at the federal level and all of the affected states have submitted their conservation strategies, i.e. management plans. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has looked at them, agreed with them, or worked to iron out the wrinkles. And upon delisting, management of the species goes back to the state to operate under their management plan that they've agreed to.
That sort of encapsulates it. I guess one of the things, maybe for people to understand, any person can petition to have a species listed,
right,
or group.
Right.
I mean, anyone can petition. When they submit a petition, they're supposed to provide information on why they feel that the species needs to be listed as either threatened, and threatened means a species that's likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. Endangered means a species that's likely to become extinct, right, in the foreseeable future. So they submit a petition, and that goes to the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Department of Interior, and they're the deciders on whether or not the petition. Now they can decide different things. They can decide that, yes, the petition presents information that indicates that the action is warranted to list the species. They can make a decision that the action is not warranted, that, no, I'm sorry, your petition to list robins as endangered, it falls short here. Or they can make a decision that the petition is, yes, it's warranted, but we're precluded because we have so many other things we're working on, we can't get to it right now.
Right.
And what you see a lot of times is that if they make the warranted but precluded finding, then what happens is there's usually litigation will follow that, and the groups that petition will try to say, well, we don't care how busy you are, we want you to make a decision on this thing and move it forward to being listed. Right. Now, when you look at that, the key things to understand the process is the decider is, the federal agency. And initially, again, I think ESA was intended to be more of a cooperative effort,
yep,
but the decision is theirs, and they're the ones that are litigated. the decision to under the federal ESA to list or delist is a federal one.
Right.
And because of litigation, it's really been pushed strictly into that sort of arena. It's not, the states have really limited ability. And of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service gets busy. They have a lot on their plate. And so there are times where, I know that state agencies have been somewhat frustrated, like, hey, look, we've got, I remember when we were litigated on our grizzly bear hunting season in Montana in the Northern Continental Divide. And, the judge, and he never did say that he issued an injunction which stopped the hunt, but he never issued a decision that said that we shouldn't have been hunting. And there was comments like, well, man, you guys got great data, but unfortunately the service hadn't, utilized that because there was so much stuff going on, and so he couldn't consider it. So we need to be aware of those things, and then how to participate in those processes. There's nothing that stops an interest group from petitioning to delist a species. Again, one of the issues around ESA, it seems like, under the precautionary kind of approach of, if we're going to make a mistake, let's make a mistake so we don't wipe things
conservatively,
out.
Right.
Conservatively. It seems like then the standard to delist becomes this giant mountain that you can't get over, and people put up things that the world changes and we change, and change is a part of things. And so if you set up a program that it will require no change in the future, you're pretty well done.
Yeah. And so the reason I bring that up is we as hunters, as a general rule, interact with our state agencies for season setting, for, whether it's our agency or our commissions. And so that's our comfort area. We interact there. We know how that process works. And so our local rod and gun clubs, or whatever local chapter of this group or that group, we feel pretty effective there. And I wanted people to understand that when the ESA starts becoming the discussion, you have to go and play the game at a federal level. And your agency is somewhat your conduit to represent you, but you yourself, you as a hunter, better be involved. And so when I'm sitting on the grizzly bear, the Yellowstone grizzly bear conservation panel, the round table, and that was one subspecies of grizzly bears, the greater Yellowstone area. And then you've been referring to the Northern Continental Divide, which is the species in northwest Montana.
It's the same animal.
It's the same animal,
Different
but
place.
considered distinct population segments. So what in this case, and I'm just trying to lay this out so that the listener can follow along, but I go to these meetings, we have open houses, we accept public comment, everything. It struck me immediately that at the first open house we had in Jackson, Wyoming, there was not a hunter in the crowd. The crowd was loaded with people who I call environmentalists. They like to call themselves conservationists, and I don't let them claim that turf. They're environmentalists. They're vocal, they're organized, they're funded. We then have a meeting in, I think it was Idaho Falls, Idaho. And now a few hunters show up, but they're all volunteers. None of them are paid staff. The room, again, is jam-packed full of the environmental crowd. And every one of them are on a payroll. And I'm thinking, holy cow, we've really got a battle here. I feel like they're the New England Patriots, well-paid professionals, and we're the local club team at the community college. It's wow, it's not looking good for the hunters at this point. And like you said, Arnie, it wasn't all about I want to hunt and shoot a grizzly bear. It was about representing our interests, because we as hunters over the course of our history have been the ones investing in conservation and habitat across these landscapes. And again, I'll use Yellowstone because that's where this was going on. Nobody has made a greater investment in habitat in the greater Yellowstone region than have hunters to support elk populations, which is kind of the peanut butter sandwich for all predators within the greater Yellowstone area. And I wanted to make sure that our interest was represented because, like I said earlier, I felt like hunters in a large part were the ones writing these checks with the elk we're supposed to give up, which I don't mind sharing the resource. But should we be the ones who give up everything in terms of opportunity, in terms of what our investment has been to the landscape? And everybody else just says, oh, well, yeah, no, just don't worry about that. You hunters are just too bad. That's the way it is. Well, if you want us to be incentivized to continue to participate in conservation in the greater Yellowstone area, don't take all the fruits of our labor and claim it as your own for whatever your own agenda might be.
Yeah, I think, Randy, that's, again, it's one of those the issues. Start with one of the things. A lot of times hunters don't know when and how to participate, recognizing that a lot of the non-governmental groups, that's what they do.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, yes, they do have paid staff. They understand very well the points in the process where if you go early in a process where it's scoping and that's just to identify the issues, you can get up and go, I'm a hunter and I'm worried about what impact they're going to have on elk resources or whatever. I mean, it can be written down and it will be addressed in the document, but it really is in a draft document where you can come in and then at least under the statutes, when those comments come in, then they have to be addressed.
Right.
I mean, they can, if they're a comment that's significant that has to be addressed or show how it was addressed. So a lot of times that you'll see the hunting community doesn't understand when and how to participate in these things to make sure that their interest is on the table. Now, I feel like if you do processes well, and unfortunately we do a lot of processes not very well. I mean, you talk about the process at the state level with the commission and the commissioners and our state agency people. There are other interests that feel poorly represented in that process. They don't understand that they have the ability to impact, or they can communicate, they can testify at a commission season setting just like you or I or anybody else. And so they're uncomfortable with that process. The same thing happens with hunters on some of these bigger processes at a bigger scale nationally. And I think that's one of the things that needs to change, is that hunters need to be able to support their organizations that do understand when and how to participate in those bigger processes. But in terms of a local, there are all kinds of things that happen at a local level. There's forest plans and BLM land management plans and state lands plans and stuff that the hunters can start by interacting at those processes and making sure that their voice is heard. And I do fully understand that a lot of the times, you have a hunter who, and really, to be honest with you, a lot of times even landowners, they show up and it's on their dime and their time. And, and the room's full of all these other people, including the agency people like I was, getting paid, you know. And agencies like to set up meetings that are convenient for, we'll set it up for Thursday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Well, if you're a working guy, that probably doesn't work too good, or you may set it up on an evening that and stretch it a little bit. But I think the programs that really work, and I think this is one of the things to always keep in mind, is that there will be other interests at the table. I mean, people, the guys that harvest trees on the forest, the people that are interested in oil and gas resources, the people that hunt and fish, the people that, use like to ATV, the people that cross-country ski. I mean, a program, when you utilize a process the right way, you can end up with good programs that work. I think perfection is an idea that we need to get out of our head, because it's not life.
No.
But the problem that I've seen with the way these processes work is that people feel like the process is how you develop the program. And my perspective is it's not. Really, the process is a tool that you use to bring people together, where they're in a forum, in a way where they can bring their perspectives, their ideas, their solutions, where they can be respectfully heard. And then there's an arbitrator or someone that's running the process that utilizes that input to come up with a program. In the end, when you do that, it was like with the bear plan that you worked on, the conservation strategy. In the end, then you can have a program that has broader support. It doesn't mean that the people are going to support everything about it, but it's been really interesting to see, if you're upfront with people and you're honest. That's, by the way, another one of the key things.
Right.
I always tell people, if you want to build good programs, you have to have trust. Yep. And so what does it take to build trust? It's a really interesting thing. What it takes, from my perspective, it takes two things to build trust. It takes honesty and it takes time. So I may, go down the street and see some student at MSU and he looks like a nice person. I'm probably not going to just say, hi, I'm Arnie Dood. Here's my wallet. I'll come back in a month. And, I mean, it may be but I don't know. And so if you look at a lot of the problems with these programs, it's really been fascinating in terms of like some of the groups, when they've approached them, they've approached it in a way that isn't honest. So you sort of put forth that, oh yeah, we'll be flexible, and then behind the scenes you're doing everything you can to deny that or to do away with that flexibility. And that's the kind of thing that really makes for bad programs in the long run. And then the other thing is it takes time. And I think that's one thing that, in our world today, it's so hard for people. I mean, I marvel at it. We're both, part of different hunter conservation groups. Right. And you'll have an annual banquet, and there'll be, I've seen 600 people. And they're there, and they love the resource, and they're passionate, and they contribute their money. But then you'll have a meeting in their own town that can really have huge long-term impacts on that resource, and nobody shows up. Right. And that's what I think we've got to find out how we can do better, how we can help hunters. And I really, to be honest with you, see that's one of the things where the agencies sort of fall down, is they're not been very good about helping people understand, where those points in the process are and how to make sure that their interest gets in. Doesn't mean that their interest is going to overwhelm other people's, right. But it needs to be, like you said, you were at the table. Now, the other thing is that I'm a big advocate for processes that open the door. I don't know what a landowner in eastern Montana may need in order to accept some prairie dogs or black-footed ferrets in his lands and surrounding lands. They have to be able to share what they see as their problems and potential solutions. I don't know what an environmental, there's all kinds of different NGOs, and they have different levels of acceptance for different, right. management tools or whatever, and we can work through those things when we're in a room together. And I want to bring people together so that we all get to learn from each other. And I've seen it so many times in where you could I love Grizzly Bears. I just want Grizzly Bears. That's it.
Right.
Everybody else should
stand
if
back.
You don't like it, go away.
Yeah,
But and sometimes I've told people, well, if you want everybody to leave Montana, you and your buddies go first, and then I'll decide. Don't push me off the cliff, and then you guys are going to be the last ones here. Lead by example. But when I've seen where you can have someone that I don't think grizzly bears should just be left alone, and you have a person that says I live here. This is where I live. And it's not rocks and ice wilderness. I had a grizzly bear on my back porch. I banged pots and pans, and it wouldn't go away. I shot at its feet. It wouldn't go away. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old that can't go out in my own yard. And then all of a sudden, what you see is those barriers start to break down. Yep. So that's, to me, what good process is. And again, recognize so much of these things, people will have a plan developed, and then they'll use the process to try to provide cover for what they have in mind. And that creates that dishonesty. It creates that lack of trust.
Exactly what you said there, Arnie, and I'm glad we got to this point, because when you say, kind of have a front argument of I want to be cooperative, but then in the back room, the strategy is how do we leverage this to some different agenda. And it happened in the Grizzly Bear process. There were three people on that panel who were a paid staff of environmental groups. And so I'm looking around. I'm like, well, me and the guy representing the ranchers down in Wyoming, he's self-employed. I'm self-employed. The sheep guy from Montana is self-employed. The timber guy from Idaho, he's self-employed. And we're here on our own dime, and we're trying to get up to speed. Well, on the panels, three people who are very well paid on these groups, and over the course of the 2 or 3 years of discussion and meetings and everything else, we talked about habitat as being a core issue related to grizzly bear recovery. Cool. I read all the habitat criteria, everything. I'm like, you know what? That's good for elk. I'm on board with that. So I'm talking and having, discussions with these groups who represent what I'm going to call the environmental world. And they're lobbying everyone, hey, we really want these habitat criteria, da-da-da. Okay. And one of the things at the beginning, we all got to throw out our one, and the moderator was very good about it. Each of you get to kind of lay out what your drop dead issue is, or your biggest issue that you probably can't vote for this plan if it's not in there. And I hesitated about throwing this out there as my issue. But I knew with eventual state control, if that's the end goal of delisting, that the history, the culture, the societal values in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming is that hunting is always important to who we are. So I threw out there that hunting needs to be an accepted part of the state plans. That was my one thing. And if you read the conservation strategy, it's in there. As it says something like, hunting will be an accepted management tool by the states, da-da-da. And these environmental groups, when I threw that out there, at first their eyes got big, and then they're like, yeah, okay, we'll deal with that. Now they use, behind the scenes, I'm sure there was a strategy session that said, let that be in there. We'll use it as our big screaming pitch a fit issue if ever they get delisting. We're going to make it sound like they're going to kill all the grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone region. And that process of their front people saying, oh yeah, that's fine, we don't have a problem with hunting, saying that, and then the minute the conservation strategy is finalized and given the okay, the governor sign off, the director of the interior signs off, the secretary, these groups make it sound like that conservation strategy is all about hunting. Yeah. It's not. That conservation strategy is about recovering grizzly bears to the selected criteria, the objectives we set. And so that whole process completely causes me to say, I don't trust the process. I don't trust the incentives that are in place or the mechanisms that can create some perverse incentives. And I always thought Randy Newberg was kind of a reasonable guy. And Arnie's laughing right now because he sees how red my face is as here it is, 12 years later, and I talk about this, I still get mad. But I think hunters may not have had that much of an individual experience like I did to see it happen, but they see it happen on the outside, and we saw it with the whole wolf thing where the goalpost kept moving and kept moving. Okay, you and I sat in these meetings around the Yellowstone region one in, 93, 94, 95. All right, let's talk about maybe we can bring wolves here. And all right, what are going to be the population objectives? And we even got into the argument, and at the time we were having the argument, I didn't quite understand the importance of it, but now I do. There was the big argument, is the objective going to be a recovered population or a viable population? Because there's a big difference between recovered and viable. And so now, all this stuff, all these, I use that as an example of like 20 different places we argued about. Yeah. And then we all come to an agreement. All right, we need 10 breeding pairs, 100 wolves in each state, over the course of 3 years. And then, when that agreement was signed, I'm like, all right, if the biologists are correct in their projections, by 2000, 2001, we'll meet the recovery objectives. And management of wolves will be handed over to the states as quick as our plans are approved. That's how naive I was.
Yeah, I think one of the things, if you get into another issue with the ESA, is how do you define recovery? And one of the problems is that, again, remember what I talked about with like peregrine falcons. We didn't say 20 was it.
Right.
We said that was the level the population was able to continue to move forward and ultimately flourish. And today there's over 100 and some occupied territories in Montana. Our falconers are able to, take young falcons for falconry purposes again. I think that's one of the things is that people look a lot of times that was the target. So
right.
If it was 300, that's it. Well, if you have 300 and you have insurmountable problems, that's going to be a huge issue. You could end up with significantly more if you have good programs in place, and then have things like the population able to move across the landscape, and so you can minimize more genetic issues, things like that. And so, to me, what happens again, it's a reflection of the way, and I think that things that need to be changed about ESA is how do we, give people. Again, I want your perspectives, and I want that to be part of the program and others. I mean, environmentalists, I call them non-governmental because there's all different gradations. There's some
right.
of them that are accept a lot more flexibility, and there's some of them that won't
right.
accept any.
Right.
So to me, I look at those things and say, how can we do these programs in a way that you can feel like you were part of the process, that your interest was brought forward and respected, and that the legitimate things about hunting are in there, and they are a functional part of the program. I think if it's like, yeah, we'll just say it's there, but we know that we can do all these other things and throw these in, a hurdle in front of you so it can never be implemented. And I'll give you an example of that, because you see this often with wolves and bears.
Yep.
It's grizzly bears. Is that okay? Well, you can. We'll let that hunting be in there, but then the hurdle that gets come out is, well, you have to prove.
Correct.
So you have to prove how many bears are out there before we can accept that. And then even if you prove how many there are, then you have to prove that that's viable under some shifting
right.
definition that geneticists may come up with.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're caught there. And a lot of times with a species like, a significant predator like a wolf, by the time you get the proving done, it's too late to get the management done. So yeah. Those are the things that I think we have to look at in ESA. How can we provide, and it isn't just with wolves or bears, but with other animals.
Right.
How can we provide people assurances that when they participate and they commit for the right things, that they don't get beat over the head for it?
That is it, Arnie. And unfortunately, when I say, I think that the environmentals were in the back room strategizing, I look at how unprepared or what amateur hour it is for us hunters when we show up, because we've not made this a business model. We've not made it part of our fundraising tools. And so we are so far behind the curve on this, as are the ag interests, as are the timber interests, the landowner interests. We haven't built organizations with professionals, with attorneys to say, we're going to sit at the table and we are going to make a big part of our mission representation and interaction and whatever you want to call it in these ESA, T&E, threatened and endangered species issues. So those groups, to their credit, they're pros at it. They exactly what you talked about, how they are informed, they're engaged, they know every part along the way. And I often wonder, okay, is it our own fault for not making our own groups to build them and say, we got our conservation and habitat and access and everything else, but somewhere along the way, we need a group that is ready to engage and represent our interest the same as they do. Because right now, they got the paid pros.
That's right.
And they win because it's part of their focus. When they sit down and do strategic planning for their organizations, it's one of their strategic goals.
Yeah.
You don't ever see that in a hunting group or a conservation group that says, "Oh, one of our strategic goals is we're going to invest a lot of money in changing policy through the Endangered Species Act."
That's right, Randy. And I think one of the things too, keep in mind that, if you look at a lot of groups, win should be defined in a lot of common ground. I mean,
Right.
win for me as a hunter is having a healthy bear population where I could potentially hunt grizzly bears out of my, out of Bozeman where I live.
Right.
I mean, I was on a mountain goat hunt, some years back in south of town here by about 80 miles and saw a grizzly bear. And I thought, I saw moose and elk and grizzlies and black bear and all in one hunt on it. And grizzlies should be incorporated into our programs that we have in the future. Likewise, if your perspective is you want to see those animals out there, they are. They are a part of the environment. I mean, you can go. Wolves are a part of Montana now. And so that should be, it doesn't mean win being defined as that the game's over and you're the only one standing on the victory thing.
Right.
Win is defined as, we're able to move forward. It's no different than a win for a guy that works in the timber industry. A win is that he's assured that he can conduct business and make a living and
Right.
take care. And same with the private landowner, ranchers, and others. And so,
Right.
again, I look at we got to find a way to bring people together, and what happens is that you can build that trust because you find a way where people are able to start being honest about. Now, if you're a person that's opposed to hunting, period, you're going to say,
Right.
I'm opposed to hunting, period. And the truth is that there are places where there is no hunting.
Right.
And so, yeah, not everywhere. But there are places where that interest of yours is met. Now, if your interest is everywhere, it's not going to be met. Likewise, there are people who say, I just don't want these animals out there. Well, there are programs in place that can deal with the impacts of those things, but that interest of they're just not going to be part of the world are not going to be met. So that's to me what building effective programs is about. There was this last spring there was a story about I think it was on the John Day River somewhere in Oregon, where there was a community there. There had been timbering. It was an important part of the economy, and it was just going down, down, down for a whole variety of things. And there were a couple of players there that took the time to get together, to know each other. They took their families camping. They started to build trust, and they started to bring the community together. And then there was an issue about there wasn't sufficient supply for the mill to keep functioning, which was going to be a huge impact to the town. And the people there were able to get together and work through it and come up with a reasonable approach. That's the kind of thing that I think we need to look at it in a broader level. So with the bears and delisting, we need to find ways through that delisting discussion. I mean, and it should be a test of, okay, are the programs in place? Is there monitoring in place? I can't guarantee it with, like with the peregrine falcons, the ESA requires 5 years post-delisting monitoring. We did that. The Fish and Wildlife Service decided 15 years, looking at it every 3 years for 15 years. And we met those things, and we were able to show the population is doing fine. It's continuing to increase and recover. And so those are legitimate things. If your approach is I'll just throw out enough confusion so I can litigate and stop it, that's really a counterproductive approach. And unfortunately, that's what starts to alienate the hunting community. I mean, most hunters, you get a few that are I want everything apparently gone off the earth except for elk or whatever.
Right.
But I mean, there's hunters that don't support having wild bison. I mean, what's that about? But, if you look at most hunters, you just said earlier today, I'm willing to share. Okay, yeah, and I'm willing to share. And I understand that may mean I have to adjust I'm not willing to give up everything.
Correct.
And so you're the interest on the other side of the table. They get everything, and I get nothing on the deal. Now we're not in a good place.
And that's exactly where I'm going with this. Well, Arnie, before we go on to the next piece, I'm going to quickly pay a bill here, if you want to call it that. I'm going to talk about a product that I've been using lately. It's made by Orion Coolers. Those of you who are kayakers, who Jackson Kayak is. And Jackson Kayak has got into the cooler market because everyone said, oh, rotomolded coolers they are made based on what the kayaking world does to make kayaks. And I guess if you're going to make great coolers, you start with the best kayak company in the world, Jackson Kayak. So I've been using the Orion Coolers, and the people who got them into the cooler market are hunters, and you can tell by looking at it. And they're fishermen. The features, the designs, everything about them has some purpose. It's not like random. Oh, let's just make it this dimension, this size, this thickness. Let's just make the handles this way or that way. No, everything about an Orion cooler has a purpose to it. Whether it's the tie downs, whether it's the corners. Uh, my camera guys, they love the corners of the Orion coolers because there's a bottle opener there. And I'm not allowed to drink beer, but they are. The way the handles are, the handles, some of these coolers, you lift them and the handles put your fingers right up against the corner of the cooler, and it's like, oh, this doesn't work. Not the Orion coolers. They're a long enough handle. They have a rope. And I throw those things out there because they just, every part about it, the low profile locking lids, the gaskets, the dividers inside them, the fact that the divider becomes a kitchen quality cutting board. It's almost like they said, Randy Newberg, if you were to design a cooler, what would it look like? Even though I wasn't involved in the design, it'd probably look very much like an Orion cooler. So I give you that because I think you as the listeners, the avid outdoors person, would be very well served to go and check out Orion coolers. Use them, abuse them, beat them up the way that I do, and I guarantee you they are built to last. They're built to keep stuff cool. And you can find everything about them at orioncoolers.com. And with that, we're going to jump back into our discussion with Arnie. So, Arnie, thanks for holding off while I made that pitch there. My involvement for 3 years in Grizzly Bears kind of made me the loudmouth in the hunting world, at least in this part of the region, about ESA issues and how it impacts hunters. So I got sucked into the wolf thing, which, that's it. And we'll do another podcast about the wolf issue. Point being, I thought I did my 3 years of hard duty on threatened and endangered species representing hunters with the Grizzly Bears. Well, little did I know I had another 10 years ahead of me with wolves. But I was glad to be involved because what I learned in the grizzly bear process, I was no longer the babe in the woods.
That's right.
When it came to the wolf issue. And the wolf issue brought me to even a higher level of understanding of the process, but also the understanding of strategy. And I would like to think that Randy Newberg entered this whole process thinking, hunters have always been about expanding of species. And I don't care what species it is, wild sheep, elk, deer, turkeys. We've always been about more species on the landscape. But the land is the basic. We go back to Leopold and his writings that it all starts with the land. Everything goes from there. And maybe it was naive. Maybe it was Randy's this kind of dreamer that, hey, can't we all just get along, But I am now, this process between grizzly bears and wolves has converted Randy Newberg to a skeptic that the ESA can ever be a mechanism, as it currently is, can ever be a mechanism for success. Because it's fraught with potential for abuse, the manner in which process works. Some groups can be sent forward as the front person to sell the deal, while the rest of the army's in the background figuring out where is the artillery and how do we hit the targets once the truce or the treaty's signed. And maybe I'm tainted, maybe I'm scorned, I don't know, Arnie, but as hunters, my point in all of this is we as hunters have to learn more about how this process works.
Exactly.
We need to understand the nuances and intricacies, and whether it's us individually or the groups that we look to for leadership, Or maybe we somewhere along the way need a new group that says, I'm going to represent hunters in these discussions the same way as the Center for Biological Diversity in Tucson, Arizona has nothing but attorneys on staff.
Yeah.
They engage and litigate every one of these issues. Maybe we need to get there.
I'd hope there's a couple of things. I understand the skepticism and, the difficulty of it, but we're hunters, and I climbed the mountain the first time and didn't get the goat.
Right.
And so I went back up the mountain again until I did.
Right.
And so it isn't a way to pull back, but it is a way, Randy, and I think you're talking about the kinds of issues that need to be discussed in the hunting community. How are we going to participate? How can we see that we're effective? And really the message again of the hunter conservationist is a powerful one.
Right.
I mean, and so how can we get that as being part of the program? Even one of the other species like sage grouse. Let's face it. There was a move. The first people to take off the table was the hunters.
Right. Yeah. Let's close all hunting seasons, even though we know that hunting doesn't affect long-term viability of sage grouse.
So again, yes, there has to be a way that the hunting community can find, and they can do it. There's nothing that keeps the hunting community from being more effective if they so choose in these kinds of discussions.
Right.
And again, it's like the frustration with the grizzly bear, and we can see it coming.
Yeah.
I mean, it was delisted and then it was relisted.
Right.
There'll be a move at some point here, again, because the information's there, the programs are in place to move forward with the delisting. You can see probably, some more litigation around that, but because there's a lot. Well, what if bears are omnivores, but some of the food sources are maybe on in not as good a health as they could be. So what if? Well, if you do that, I mean, you can delay progress on some potential future thing that could happen. The caldera could blow up. Then what about that? So we wouldn't be having a discussion today.
Yeah.
But so to me, I look at those things and I think about how is it that we can change ESA so that when we make commitments, unless there's a compelling reason and people are brought back to the table to discuss that there aren't just a change made with, well, we decided, this level or this was acceptable today, but we've decided now it's going to be twice that.
Right.
That's not a way to build confidence. And if you look at, I think the other story that needs to come out here is we've had success in Montana. And if you look at the states with the Northern Continental Divide, with the Yellowstone, along with our surrounding states, notably Wyoming, even the Cabinet Yaak in Montana, we're augmenting grizzly bears in the Cabinet Yaak and trying to rebuild that segment of the population because the connections are being sort of restored with it, and that's good.
Right.
But if we're not able to make progress here, I mean, think about this. The grizzly bears have been listed since 1975.
Right.
The Bitterroot ecosystems is bigger than the Yellowstone ecosystem. And how much progress have we made?
Zero.
How much have we made in some of the other the Cascades and others
Zero.
where the bear? And to me, it's like the way I phrase it is that if we can't live with success in some of these areas and move forward, then we will live with failure.
Right.
Because if you're going to be skeptical, which you have a right to be, if we meet the levels and we have a reasonable program in place, I mean, there's no certainty. You're trying for a level of reasonableness that these programs should give the bear a decent chance, and you have monitoring in place to see that that's what's happening.
Yep.
And if it's not, you have to go back and reevaluate. If we're not able to make progress, then your perspective is no different than a landowner in eastern Montana or across the U.S. with why should I participate? If I do, then you're going to come and whack me over the head.
No good deed goes unpunished.
And that's one of the things that I think, and we look at the ESA and how to work in the future. I think that's one of the things. Those are the kinds of discussions that are going to have to occur. how can we make it more effective? How can we reward success? How can right now there's a lot of rewards for not participating. I mean, it's why people have plowed up sagebrush because I'll tell you what, I won't deal with this. I'll just get the tractor out and put it upside down.
Then I don't have to deal with sage grouse.
And so we create these sort of negative incentives, and I think we've got to find ways. And that's one of the things to restore. I want to point out a couple of things. One of the things that was in a lot of my work and in my career it was funded by hunters. And,
right.
and I don't think anybody's out there going to be blasting away at piping plovers.
No.
And so to me,
or peregrine falcons.
But there's still people that are engaged, and the hunters are engaged in these broader things, and their hunters aren't about wiping things out either. And so, how do we find a way to make sure that their interests are in fact met and they're not pushed aside? And again, it's interesting that I think initially there was flexibility that was in the act for reasonable tools that it's hard to understand for people. How is it that a hunter can actually harvest an animal and that can promote conservation? That's a really hard.
It's a hard story to tell
for people that don't hunt to understand that. It's a hard story to tell, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be told or that the truth of it shouldn't be shared with people. How do we encourage people to participate in ESA programs when they, I see the same arguments happening, as if you look at around large predators in other states and places, the same arguments are happening, and we're not getting across the kinds of tools that are there. We have to be able to show that, no, you can make progress, and you can do these things, and you can fit animals in, you can include the hunters. If you're interested in having grizzly bears on the landscape, what would be wrong with having some in Colorado? I had a lady from Colorado tell me one time, she was on their Fish and Game Commission, that we can't have them in Colorado because we have people in ski resorts. I said, well, let's go to Whitefish.
Yeah, Montana, we have people in ski resorts.
Or Big
also.
Sky.
Yeah.
I mean, south of town here. So let's look at some of these things, and I think find ways. And more effective ways. Let's use what we've learned and the problems that have developed, the issues around litigation. I think there's times where there's legitimate concerns about maybe how a program was put together or the issues that are out there, but we're also well aware that a lot of it's around, well, my agenda is like, I don't like hunters, and so here's a tool that I have that has nothing to do with success of a program or restoring the animal. It has to do with the fact I don't like hunters, and so I'm going to.
Yeah, and so we're going to we got time to get to the one big tool these groups use. But before that, you and I talked about this, and we talked about it when we were doing grizzly bears, when we were working on wolf management plans. It pisses me off. When a hunter does this, I just want to walk up and kick him right in the crotch. And it's when he says, kill all those bastards. Kill all the wolves. Kill all the grizzly bears. Manger the earth. That is, no matter what we do, no matter how hard we work, when we get some knucklehead that goes and says that thing, that's what ends up in the newspaper. That's what people, their mind is like, see, I told you, those hunters, it's all about them. They're so selfish. It's this, it's that. Yep. And I guess I'm asking any of these listeners, first of all, don't do something that dumb. And if your buddy says that in public or posts it somewhere or writes it, straighten him up. Because I cannot tell you how hard it was to overcome those kind of comments when you are the minority on a panel. When you are trying to sell the greater public on the idea that, hey, we as hunters are the leaders in conservation, which we are. Yeah. You got these idiots who say that stuff.
Yeah. It's very frustrating, and I dealt with that, throughout my career with, you can have all the guys that are coming in with good programs, genuine, and then you have a guy that will, stand up and make a statement like that, and again, yes, I mean, that's the nature of people, is they're going to focus on those kind of comments. And so, of course, the media gravitates to that, and it hits that, just wipe these, things off the face of the earth. And to me, how do you expect the public then to have any trust that if there is flexibility to hunt or trap or do other things, that you're going to utilize that in a reasonable way when you make these unreasonable statements? And it's similar, people make statements. It isn't just hunters. I mean, we're hunters, so I think it's important to be direct with them. There are other people that go, well, I had a person tell me a wolf should never die. Well, Randy, we don't get that. I mean, all of us here are going to take that journey at some point.
Right. Yeah.
So, but when you have hunters that make that comment, it's, these animals are legitimate. I'm 100% that we need to be managers. That's what we do. That's what success is about, is being able to manage in a reasonable way. But when people make those kind of statements, and believe me, other people hear it and it gets put out there, it's the same kind of thing that, when you're asking for flexibility and somebody, wants to dangle wolf puppies on a barbed wire fence, your credibility goes out the window.
Absolutely. And in the amount of time that we spend having to work on damage control, image repair, whatever you want to call it, when people do that, we don't have a lot of extra resources to allocate to our involvement in these discussions to start with. The last thing we need is hunters saying that and chuckling about it and promoting it as, that's who I am. We my grandparents killed all these wolves, blah, blah, blah. Why the hell do we need them? You know what? We need them because if we as hunters are true to what we say, that conservation is about expansion of all species, how can you say we should expand wolves, but there's no place for grizzly bears? Or, I mean, we should expand elk, but there's no place for grizzly bears. And we all know as the most, 98% of hunters are going to say, what, there's a balance. There's a place for all of it. But my point is,
I've heard people say things, and I was actually at a meeting one time, and it was one of the things you hear from certain segments was shoot, shovel, and shut up. And there was a lady that was there and was representing our state senator at the time, and she just looked at him and said, "That's a really stupid thing to say. I wish you'd stop."
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of message. Let's get over that. We can legitimately talk about management. We can talk about the needs for a prey base for predators. And we're part of that. We're part of the success of that. We need to be a part of the future of that. We can talk about those things. But when you make those comments, to me, that it just really hurts, and it hurts in a big way because it gets played out in a big way. So
and as much as we don't trust, over the course of time, I've become to the point where I don't trust them as a group. I'll just admit right now, Randy Newberg does not trust the environmental community when it comes to these discussions, and as such, that's why I will advocate and fight tooth and nail that no, the Mexican wolf should not be expanded beyond what was agreed to 8 or 10 years ago. No, until the process has changed, I would never advocate for grizzly bears in the Bitterroot. And that's sad when you think about it, that a hunter feels so betrayed that he would suggest no, at least until process has changed. Which gets me to the next discussion. Because for my blood pressure, I have to erase from my memory how hard it was for me to make our cause on wolves and grizzly bears when some hunter would stand up and say something stupid. I can't.
Randy, how you feel. How do you think people on the other that have a different interest, how do you think they feel when they're trying to come. There are people in the, if you want to call it the environmental community, that are trying to come up and are more flexible. And how do they feel when some guy stands up and goes, "Now's the time to wipe these bastards"?
And that's the point I was going to get to. Now I have to put myself in their shoes. The same way I feel betrayed and distrustful.
Exactly.
They are going to feel the same betrayal, or at least lack of trust, when some chucklehead stands up at a public meeting or submits a public comment that kill them all. That puts me in the same, it causes the view of who Randy Newberg thinks the hunter should be, causes our image to be the same as what I've come to grow. So you're exactly right, aren't you? That builds no trust. It erodes trust. That's and it erodes it quickly.
Yeah.
And it completely wipes out our credibility on the discussion.
And I think, we all understand that in life, the way these things work is that there's always going to be a voice on the edge.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is that with the hunting community, with any of these communities actually, the environmental community, same sorts of thing, landowners, others, that those voices, if people of reason are able to sit down and work through this stuff, those voices diminish over time. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it happen. Where initially those voices were loud and were prominent, but over time those voices faded, and the people around them. It's been fascinating to watch when process is done in a way that engages people. It ends up being, there were times, it's happened several times in my career where someone that would come in at a meeting and they would say something, and my nature, like yours, is my blood pressure goes up, my face gets red. I'm gonna have at it, but for whatever reason my tongue was stayed, and before I had a chance there were people that were there that were participating that said, no, that's not right, and we're not going to do that. And the people that work on this are then able to move forward. We're looking at, again, finding ways to change things. That's what we're talking about, and do it in a way that engages people, that can build this trust. And it doesn't mean that's not without, there's times in any relationship where it's going to be stressed, but if you have it, you're able to work through those things through time. And our objective here should be one of having these animals as a part of our world, being able to interact with them, whether that interaction is photography or hunting or some other management technique. That's the objective that we should be. I'm not, and I spent most of my life trying to restore things. You talk about, my grandpappy killed off this stuff. Well, through the homestead era, they pretty well killed off the deer and the antelope and the elk and the sheep and
everything.
And the truth of the matter is the hunters got together and the landowners and others and said, no, we need to have this back. And if you look at, the issues with large carnivores, it's interesting in Montana, even early at the turn of the century, and the Fish and Game Commission in this state published an article that said at that time bears were treated as total vermin.
Yeah.
They were doing set guns, which for those of you who don't know, set guns are where you put bait on a line and you point the gun and the bear comes and pulls the bait and the gun shoots him, and there were barrels with nails in them, and at that time, when really the perspective was by a lot of people, even wildlife, was to get rid of the predators, the commission in this state published an article that said, wait, these are magnificent animals, game animals, and they deserve to be treated better.
Right.
So that's the perspective. I think with the issues around wolves and bears in the future is that, they're magnificent animals. They have potential to have significant impacts. Let's manage those impacts, and we can do those things in a reasonable way and move towards a different future. And that's what I think is important. And we need to promote processes that allow us to do that. And we need to make sure, again, that that's one of the issues around the Endangered Species Act, is that it allows that stuff.
Right.
It's really, I think people see the need for flexibility, and I'm an advocate for that, but But if your program is we don't want to do it, then that's where the national interest of all of us should come in and say, no, we want it. We want those things. I want alligators, and so I maybe go get one someday. And I like seeing pelicans, and I want these things to be part of our world, and the little things.
Yep.
I think about that because it's easy to focus in because of the public discussions on the big things, but I've had people say, oh, it's some stupid little fly, let's just wipe it out. I'm not about wiping it out.
No.
Watch some of the nature programming. My God, there's some pretty cool things that these little guys do, different critters, and that's not our role. And hunters are the ones.
We started that. We are the ones who started the conservation ethic in the United States.
Right.
And so we have a not only a history of being engaged in this, but I think we've taken it as our responsibility to the natural world that we as hunters, whether it's something we hunt and eat or something we don't hunt, we're going to advocate for it.
Yeah.
But because of time constraints, I'm going to go into this one issue, and maybe we should have interjected it earlier. But it's the one piece that I see used as the billy club that the other side has that we've really on our side we've kind of said no, we're not going there. And I'm going to lay the background for the listener who is maybe not engaged in this, but the Boone and Crockett Club has really done some great writing, some great research of this thing. It's called the Equal Access to Justice Act. And some of you are saying, Randy, what does that mean? Well, here's what it is. Back, I think it was about the time the ESA came in. It was in the late 60s or early 70s, somewhere in that era. Congress passed a law, and I kind of think of it as the little old lady law, that it was designed so that if the federal government is in some way, shape, or form flexing its muscles against the little old grandma and she doesn't have the resources to fight the government, she can hire an attorney, and if she, as the term is written in there, substantially prevails or prevails in some substantial manner, she will get reimbursed for her attorney fees, or he. And there's these net worth requirements that, you have to, if you're a corporation or you're a business or an individual, you only will get reimbursed if your net worth is under a certain amount, so that the Bill Gates of the world can't go and sue the federal government and then say, hey, I'd like to be reimbursed for my attorney fees. So I looked at some stuff from the General Accounting Office up through about 1998 was when this report was issued. 48% of the cases, and even a higher percentage of the money awarded under the program, was for Social Security claims. People who were denied Social Security who deserved it. And now I'm sure the listener's like, Randy, where the hell is this going? Well, somewhere along the way, some very smart attorney for the environmental groups said, you know what? There's a clause in there, or I don't know if they got it changed or if it had been in there all the time, that nonprofit organizations, 501c3 organizations, which 501c3 is the code of the Internal Revenue Code, or the section of the Internal Revenue Code that identifies you're a nonprofit organization with charitable intent. Somehow we got to the point where there's an exclusion of that net worth amount for 501c3 organizations. So now, under NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, or the Endangered Species Act, or other places, the environmental community has realized we can sue the federal government and get reimbursed our attorney fees and reasonable attorney and other costs. So if you are based in San Francisco, I think the last case I read, the reimbursement rate is a little over $300 per hour.
A lot more than a state wildlife guy.
So here's kind of the business model that has evolved from that. You are an environmental group and you have a huge staff of attorneys. And you're paying them $60 an hour, which equates to about $125,000 a year salary.
Still way more than a state wildlife guy.
And you find every little bit of forest plan, any type of action proposed by a government, a federal agency, anything under the ESA, NEPA, any of these environmental rules, and you litigate, and you litigate, and you litigate. And because it's so complex, sooner or later you might find some technicality that you prevail on. So you bring 28 claims under one lawsuit, and you prevail on one or two of the very small claims. You paid your staff attorney $60 an hour. You get reimbursed at a rate of $300 an hour in San Francisco. You just made a margin of $240 an hour for every hour you could prove that staff attorney under your employment worked. That's a hell of a business model. I mean, I'm in the CPA world and we charge for, an hourly rate. But we don't have those kind of margins. Yeah. And so it creates a perverse incentive for them to go and send the front guy out there that, tell them we're good with that. But in the back room, the attorneys for these groups, and I know they're going to be mad and say, Newberg, here he goes again. He's out in the weeds. From my view, this is Randy Newberg's opinion. They are doing this with full intent that, we'll agree with this out in front of the public and look like reasonable people. But when the ink is dry the next day, we are litigating. Is there anything that we've seen in the ESA world that has not been litigated?
There have been a few, but it's very few.
It's very few. And so this, and even in NEPA, all these federal level things, and what happens? They go and they prevail on one. I mean, so the word substantial in this this Equal Access to Justice Act, maybe the judges have a different idea of what substantial is.
I guess a couple things out here is that, through the course of my career, I became aware of this, and that the Equal Access to Justice Act was coming up as being a factor, and the way it came initially, it came about. It wasn't that it was on its face just laid out there. This was what was happening, but we would see different litigation that would move forward, and then ultimately, the attorney fees would be covered. And so I could, again, the concept behind the act, the little old lady or whatever, we understand that.
It was great.
You can't fight City Hall or big government. I mean, I'm a regular guy. I don't have a bank of lawyers, and if I am wronged in some way and I go in and I prevail and I'm able to recoup those, and we can understand that. But the interesting thing that struck me when I was going on, and I'm not an attorney, and the nuances of the law I don't know. What I was seeing was that there would be litigation and around an issue, ESA or some other NEPA issue or whatever. When the decision was made, and this is what I found struck me was that. Whether substantially prevail, what I saw was that when they didn't prevail.
Right.
But there was a decision that they somewhere in there's sort of something that says, well, if it was sort of a legitimate argument, so even though you didn't prevail,
right,
but it was a legitimate argument, so you would get your attorney fees. So what it was on its face was, if you litigate and win, you get your fees, and if you litigate and lose, you get your fees. And so it's like,
well, let's litigate. we can't lose. We might lose in the court, but we're going to win.
But you get to cash a check at the end of the day.
And that's why I, to this day, say that the wolf was not a canine. It's a bovine. To these groups, it's a bovine called the cash cow. Same with the grizzly bear. And so my point in bringing this up is, one, to make sure our listeners understand that there's this little piece of federal law that I think was a great law, and I would never want to see it taken away. I would like to see the loophole close that says 501c3 organizations do not qualify for reimbursement under this.
It's
And,
I think another thing too, Randy. I don't know. Again, just my exposure to it is that apparently there's no way to really find out how much has actually been reimbursed. So
exactly.
it's, to me, that's troubling. I mean, that's all of our dollars out there.
Right.
And if some group is getting a check for 23 million for litigating something, I think we ought to be able to know that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know why that really boggles me that you can't apparently, and again, maybe that's changing, but what I've saw that you weren't able to identify how much was going out.
No.
So I mean, that you think about that, I mean, it's a hell of a program where you can win, you win, you can lose, you win, and then nobody gets to know what you want.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I'm sure the listener's saying only in America, but the point is that is Congress who can change that.
That's correct.
And if we changed a small part of that law, it would level the playing field in these policy discussions related to wildlife, related to conservation of threatened and endangered species. That now, okay, you think you've got a legitimate complaint group, whatever group you are, pony up, go to court, and prove it. And I'm not saying that there's not times where these issues shouldn't be litigated. Because if we've made a commitment that this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to manage species, and we don't do that, there should be litigation.
Or there are times where if you're active and engaged, there will be times where programs are sort of put forward and implemented that have huge negative impacts on the hunting community. Right. And so we look at it from the other non-governmental groups because they have been very effective at it.
Right.
And I think again it's a matter of how do you change things to not close that door. Right. As an opportunity, but don't just keep shoveling money through the door.
Yeah, and so I throw that out there to let the listener understand how the imbalance that is out there right now. I maybe it has happened, but I'm not aware of any hunting group that has litigated and asked for reimbursement under the Equal Access to Justice Act. Maybe it's happened and I don't know of it. I am aware, in fact, Bozeman, Montana, where I live, is almost the center of the universe for some of this stuff. If I go downtown to the coffee shops on Main Street, I get a lot of, the bad eyes. I mean, they're like, here comes Newberg, that son of a bitch. He's a pain in our butt. You know what? Yeah, I am, because I'm aware of what their business model is. And they don't want the world to know that they are almost like drive-by litigators. I stole that from a friend of mine. He calls them the serial litigators or the drive-by litigators. And the reason being is we as a society, through our representatives in Congress, are not willing to change that. It is so stupid, so abusive, so ridiculous that we have something out there, like you said. If you win, you lose, or if you lose, you win. If you win, you win, and nobody knows what you won. Yeah. Why does Congress let that continue?
Again, I think that's an issue that needs to be discussed and needs to be addressed. And on the other hand, I guess it's important to keep in mind too that I keep looking for ways if we can develop and work through processes that bring people to the table, the support for that kind of stuff. It becomes less. If you have a room full of people and you're working with whatever political parties there are, with the objective of having a good program, not perfection and not winners and losers, but coming up with a good program, then the support for that kind of stuff tends to diminish. And so, I think no matter what, there'll be some avenue, like you said. You don't want to totally take the little old lady out and just serve her up or whatever. You want to have something there. It needs to be looked at. It needs to be fixed from the way it is today. But ultimately, we need to be talking about how do we get people together so that the trust is built, the programs are there, so communities can come together and address these different interests in a reasonable way. Right. That's really But this has created a situation that it's promoting uh, uh, a challenge to everything.
Yeah.
And so even groups that maybe start at the table and the back, know that they can run this course. And so
Yeah.
it's got to. There's plenty enough around ESA issues. There's plenty enough things going on there, but it's really important that the people in the hunting community, my friends and colleagues, that they find ways to speak up, that they communicate. When there's things, when agencies do come up with good programs, that those are supported. I think some of the unfortunate things is if you look at in the NGO community with wolves and delisting and the way that it's been and continues, by the way, to be played out in the Great Lakes,
states,
and others, is that what it's done. I mean, it begged a legislative response, and I'm afraid that they'll continue to push things into that arena, and that's really not a good place to be making decisions.
That is, as much as I'm frustrated with how this process has went, in the long term, I agree that having Congress determine the like we had to do with wolves, but we pretty much had a gun at our head. We were held captive by the courts, by this abusive process. Finally, we had no other recourse than to go to Congress and say, give us our delisted status that the best wolf biologists in the world have said they're not endangered. They're fine. And now we see in the Great Lakes state, I grew up in northern Minnesota. I thought everybody had wolves because I grew up in Big Falls, Minnesota, where wolves never disappeared. I thought every place had wolves until I left the center of the universe known as Couchiching County. And then you realize, oh, guess what? Not everybody has wolves. But my point is, the litigation that is continuing in the Great Lakes states is nothing more than ammunition for complete attack on the Endangered Species Act. And that's probably, that pendulum never settles in the middle.
No.
It's going to swing, and these groups are going to bitch and whine and moan, look what Congress did, they gutted the ESA. Well, guess what? You guys have acted irresponsibly in how you've used that ESA. It's just it's how it works.
It goes again when you look at these kinds of issues. It also plays out in terms of if you have a state that puts forward a program that's annihilate everything pretty much, other than so those kinds of things. Whether it's refusing to accept delisting moving forward, where states that refuse to participate in restoring some of these animals to the landscape, that's going to continue that pendulum being out one way or the other. And truthfully, with the ESA issues there's a whole lot of things that could be addressed that could make it a more effective. And I think that's what we're looking for. It's a very powerful law, but it's about how do you be more effective in terms of recognizing success, delisting when it's appropriate, even the listing decision. How do you deal with species that are inherently rare? I mean, there's a plant that's found on a mountain somewhere, and it's the only place it's ever been found. What's recovery supposed to be?
Yeah.
And if there's no imminent threats, I mean, then what role are speculative threats going to play in how animals are treated in the future? Because there's a lot of that's happening, and there's lots of issues here.
Right. And that's to my point, Arnie, is looking at what the path forward is, and I think you started what you just said there is part of the path forward. Because the path forward is not any easier than what the path was to get here.
That's correct.
If anything, I would opine that the path forward is more difficult, more complicated. When I was born, I think there were like 160 million people living in the United States, or 140 million. Now we've got, 325 million? The demand for resources is growing. The demand for our water is growing. Clean air. I mean, all of those things that affect us as humans affect the other natural folks on the landscape of wildlife. And as we as humans demand more, who's going to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves, i.e. the wild animals.
Yeah.
And none of these decisions are going to get any easier. And to me, if we are going to have a bright future for all of these species, whether we hunt them or don't hunt them, we need to, I think we're at that point where we better stop and look at what tools we're using, how are those tools used, and how can we reform or make them better so that what you talk about, people with competing interests, group with competing interests can come forward and say, you know what, at the core we're all concerned about the wild land or the wildlife or whatever. And how do we build solutions that can last?
Yeah. And I think that's spot on, Randy. That's what we need to be focusing on and looking on. I guess and just one sort of wrap up thing is that there are models there. There are things that can show success. I mean, we had no swift fox left in Montana. They were disappeared in the 20s. And it wasn't that people hated swift fox and wanted to do away with it, but there was sort of indiscriminate use of certain poisons and things that, and they were real vulnerable to that because they'd come in and grab a little bite, and there's been some habitat issues or whatever. But the truth is there was concern expressed about swift fox, and states were able to get together, people were able to come together. The swift fox was, there was efforts made to restore swift fox in Canada north of us and other places, and Montana benefited from that. And we now have swift fox in Montana, and they're managed as a fur bear. Peregrine falcons were largely gone. I mean, and we've been able to turn that around. We have a healthy peregrine population. We're able to allow falconers to take some birds for for falconry purposes again. Bald eagles were down to 24 nests or so in Montana, and today there's over, I think, 700 last I looked. And again, I'm not trying to say that these are all things that this isn't an individual accomplishment. These things were all accomplished by people working together, being honest with each other, and able to move forward. We have more grizzly bears. We have grizzly bears in places where they haven't been for a long, long time in Montana.
Hundreds of years.
And we have wolves, and so if you look at those things, there are ways to move forward, and there are ways, I think, to set a stage where we can do it without pitting people against each other or against the resource.
Yeah.
If you do that, if you pick one political party and that's going to be your approach versus the other, that means that you're going to lose sometime
half the
because
time.
your party's not going to be
Right.
And if you pit one group against another, even though they may have different values, they can still come together in certain places and move forward for all of us. And then I think recognizing the threats to habitat, which all animals need and we need, that those things we can focus on and work forward together. But it isn't going to happen without the hunting community being aware, being engaged, and learning how to be effective in these discussions.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, well, folks, I'm going to start wrapping this up. Arnie, this is not going to be your first appearance on the Hunt Talk Radio podcast because, now that I think this was a good discussion about the basics of how the ESA works, how it affects where we in the hunting community have our path forward. But there's going to be a time we're going to get into the actual history and guts and details of all these discussions we kind of touched on today. So, folks, with that, I hope that you will go out to randynewberg.com, which is the place where you can get anything and everything related to our platforms. The TV show Fresh Tracks with Randy Newberg, this podcast, Hunt Talk Radio, or on days when I'm really mad, Randy Newberg Unfiltered. Arnie's laughing because Arnie has seen me pop a cork once in a while in a public forum. And you can there you can also find links to our forum, the Hunt Talk forum, hunttalk.com, which is where a lot of these questions came up. In fact, many of the questions on the forum about podcast topics that we asked for related to the ESA and wolves, grizzly bears, other stuff. So you'll find links to that. You'll find where you can download all of our episodes. Download them to your phone, your computer, your tablet, whatever. And then you will also find pretty soon, by the time this airs, you'll probably find links to our YouTube channel where every episode we've ever created whether it's the old On Your Own Adventure stuff or the Fresh Track stuff, you can get at randynewberg.com. So, Arnie, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Randy.
I
for
really
having me here
appreciate
today.
your time, and I'm glad that the hunting has been good to you this fall, and I hope the fishing and every day of your retirement is exactly what you want it to be, because nobody put up with more headache and hassle in their 40 years of service than you did.
Thanks,
So,
Randy.
thank you very much.
You bet. Glad to be here.